Picture this. Rome, 64 AD. You're a senator, summoned to the emperor's palace after midnight. Your sandals echo against marble that cost more than most Romans see in a lifetime. The corridors, usually bustling with servants and petitioners, are empty except for Praetorian guards, whose eyes follow you but offer no greeting, no recognition that you're one of Rome's most powerful men. The marble corridors echo with strange music, not the traditional lyre but something wild, discordant. Syrian drums, Egyptian rattles, the smell of Eastern incense mingles with something else, fierce sweat from the guards who won't meet your eyes. As you approach the imperial chambers, you hear laughter, not joyful but manic, the kind that makes your spine stiffen. Through curtains of Tyrian purple worth more than your villa, you glimpse shadows moving in ways that make no sense. Then the curtains part. Your emperor, Nero, stands before you. But he's not dressed in the purple robes of Augustus or the military garb of Claudius. He wears a saffron-dyed wedding dress, his face painted white with lead, his lips crimson with cinnabar. His eyes, outlined in kohl like an Egyptian queen, fix on you with an intensity that makes you want to run. Beside him stands a freedman named Pythagoras, wearing the emperor's own ceremonial toga, the one embroidered with golden thread that should only touch imperial skin. Nero giggles, a sound no emperor should make, and announces that you're just in time for the wedding feast. His wedding feast, where he is the bride. This is not madness. This is something worse. This is power without limits, desire without boundaries, and you're about to witness what happens when the most powerful man in the world decides that reality itself is negotiable. Welcome to the Hollow Throne. I'm your host, and today we descend into one of history's most disturbing reigns of sexual terror, a story that Roman historians themselves struggled to believe even as they lived through its aftermath. This episode contains discussions of sexual violence, abuse of power, psychological manipulation, and acts of depravity that challenged even Rome's libertine standards. We'll be examining historical accounts of castration, forced marriages, public humiliation, and systematic dehumanization. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. But here's why this story matters. Nero wasn't just another debauched emperor in a line of debauched emperors. His reign from 54 to 68 AD represents something far more terrifying. What happens when absolute power meets complete dissolution of moral boundaries? When institutions designed to check authority instead enable it, and when an entire society becomes complicit through fear. The Roman historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio documented behaviors so extreme that for centuries scholars dismissed them as propaganda. Surely, historians argued, these must be exaggerations by Nero's enemies, but archaeological evidence keeps confirming the written records. The Golden House was real, the persecution artifacts are real, the institutional collapse was real. What makes Nero's story essential isn't the salacious details, it's the system that created him. This is a story about how institutions fail, how power corrupts absolutely, and how a society's silence becomes complicity. It's about what happens when the guardians of civilization decide their comfort matters more than their duty. Picture this. A 12-year-old boy sits at a feast in the palace of Claudius, October 13th, 54 AD. He watches his mother, Agrippina the Younger, serve his adoptive father specially prepared mushrooms. The emperor jokes about the dish. Mushrooms are, after all, the food of the gods. Within hours, Claudius is convulsing. By dawn, he's dead. The boy watches his mother's face throughout, not panicked, not surprised, satisfied. This is Nero's normal. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15, 37 AD, Nero entered a world where murder was governance and incest was strategy. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was described by Suetonius as a man hateful in every walk of life. He once deliberately ran down a child with his chariot for amusement. He gouged out a Roman knight's eye in the forum for disagreeing with him. His mother Agrippina was worse. Not in cruelty, but in ambition. Sister to Caligula, she survived that emperor's reign through a combination of submission and seduction that historians still debate. When Claudius became emperor, she orchestrated her return from exile, married him, her uncle, convinced him to adopt her son, then poisoned him when the timing was right. Modern psychologists would recognize classic markers in Nero's upbringing. Early exposure to violence, normalized transgression, absence of healthy boundaries, and what Dr. Susan Williams calls moral blindness, an inability to recognize ethical limits because you've never seen them modeled. Consider what Nero witnessed before age 16, his uncle Caligula's 4-year reign of terror and assassination, his mother's first husband mysteriously dying, his adoptive father's murder at his mother's hands, multiple palace coups and counter-coups, sexual violence as political tool. The boy was given the finest education, the philosopher Seneca as his tutor, the best Greek rhetoricians, masters of music and poetry. But what good is philosophy when your reality teacher is Agrippina the Younger? Seneca tried to instill Stoic virtues, but every lesson was undermined by the practical education of the palace. Power is everything, everyone is expendable, and rules are for the weak. By the time Nero became emperor at barely 16, he'd learned that love was possession, sex was domination, and consent was a courtesy the powerful extended only when convenient. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For the first 5 years, what historians call the Quinquennium Neronis, Nero seemed almost promising. Suetonius tells us that when presented with his first death warrant, the teenage emperor lamented, "How I wish I had never learned to write." He reduced taxes, provided disaster relief, and even banned capital punishment. But power without restraint is corrosive. It's like giving pure alcohol to someone who's never drunk wine. At first they're careful, then they're confident, then they're consumed. The first signs were seemingly harmless. Nero loved the arts, poetry, music, theatre, but he didn't just patronize artists. He wanted to be one. He forced senators to watch his performances, hours of mediocre singing while Rome's elite pretended to weep at his genius. Suetonius records that guards were posted at the exits to prevent anyone from leaving during his recitals. Some senators faked death to escape. The real corruption began with matricide. Agrippina had created an emperor, but she expected to control him. She sat behind a curtain during Senate meetings, whispering commands. She appeared on coins as his equal. She chose his lovers and dismissed his friends. By 59 AD, Nero had enough. But you can't just execute your mother. She was too popular, too connected. So Nero designed an elaborate assassination, a collapsible boat that would sink in the Bay of Naples, making it look like an accident. Picture this scene, March 59 AD. Agrippina attends her son's festival at Baiae. Reconciliation is in the air. Nero is affectionate, attentive. He insists she take his personal boat home. Halfway across the bay, the ceiling collapses. The boat splits apart. But Agrippina survives. She swims to shore, pretending not to understand what happened. When news reaches Nero that his mother lives, he panics. He sends soldiers to finish the job. Agrippina's last words, as she points to her womb, "Strike here, this bore Nero." The matricide was Nero's moral event horizon. Tacitus writes that afterward, Nero was haunted by nightmares, claiming to hear trumpet calls from Agrippina's grave. But more significantly, he'd learned he could kill anyone, even his mother, and remain emperor. If that boundary could be crossed, what boundary couldn't? After Agrippina's death, something fundamental broke in Nero, or perhaps was finally freed. The performance evolved from embarrassing concerts to something far darker. He created what he called his transformations, elaborate scenarios where he would embody different roles, each more degrading than the last. Picture this. You're a Roman noble in 61 AD, invited to one of Nero's special banquets. Refusal means suspicion. Suspicion means death. You arrive at the palace to find the triclinium transformed into a forest scene. Real trees have been transplanted inside. The floor is covered with animal skins. The air reeks of musk and incense. Suddenly, from a golden cage, Nero emerges, naked except for the skin of a bear or wolf. He crawls on all fours, snarling. Before the assembled guests stand prisoners tied to stakes. What happens next, Suetonius can barely bring himself to describe. The emperor attacks the prisoners in a grotesque pantomime of animal savagery, focusing on their genitals, while the cream of Roman society is forced to applaud. But here's what makes this historically significant. Every person in that room became complicit. The guards who tied the prisoners, the servants who built the set, the nobles who applauded, the historians who later struggled to record it. Dr. Marina Hoffman's research on institutional violence explains the mechanism. When power makes the unthinkable into spectacle, witnesses face an impossible choice: resist and die, or participate and spiritually corrode. Most choose corrosion. Each act of witness participation normalizes the next atrocity. Nero understood this instinctively. By making Rome's elite watch and applaud his depravities, he was binding them to him through shared shame. They couldn't condemn him without condemning themselves. In 64 AD, Nero decided that private depravity wasn't enough. He needed public validation of his fantasies. He orchestrated a series of marriages that mocked Rome's most sacred institutions, while challenging the very foundations of Roman masculinity and social order. First came his marriage to Pythagoras, a freedman. But this wasn't just any marriage. Nero insisted on playing the bride. He wore the saffron veil. He spoke the traditional words of a Roman wife. He even screamed in imitation of a virgin on her wedding night, all in front of the Senate and people of Rome. Tacitus, writing with barely controlled disgust, reports, Nero was given in marriage to one of that filthy herd named Pythagoras, with all the forms of regular wedlock. The bridal veil was put over the emperor, witnesses were sent to the scene, the wedding dowry, the marriage bed, the wedding torches, everything was visible, which even in a natural union is veiled by night. But Nero wasn't finished. Enter Sporus, a young freedman who had the misfortune of resembling Nero's dead wife Poppaea. Nero had him castrated, dressed him in empress's robes and married him in Greece with full ceremony. He then paraded Sporus through Rome, kissing him in public, calling him by Poppaea's name. The psychological warfare was multi-layered. First, it was an assault on gender norms that defined Roman virtue. In Roman culture, masculinity was about dominance. For the emperor to play the bride was to upend the cosmic order. Second, by forcing Romans to treat Sporus as empress, Nero was making them participate in his delusion. Reality itself became negotiable. Dr. Catherine Walsh's analysis is chilling. Nero wasn't just breaking taboos, he was demonstrating that he could redefine reality and force an empire to accept it. This is gaslighting on a civilizational scale. To understand the Sporus situation fully, we need to examine what happened to Poppaea. She was Nero's second wife, described by Tacitus as having everything but a decent mind. Their relationship was passionate, violent, and ultimately fatal. In 65 AD, Poppaea was pregnant with their second child. According to Suetonius, Nero came home late from the races. Poppaea complained. In rage, Nero kicked her in the stomach repeatedly. She died from the trauma, along with the unborn child. But here's where Nero's break from reality becomes complete. He refused to cremate her, Roman custom, and instead had her embalmed like an Egyptian queen. He declared her a goddess. Then, finding Sporus, he decided to resurrect her through this living replacement. Picture this scene. Roman citizens going about their daily business in the Forum, 66 AD. The emperor's litter passes. Beside Nero sits what appears to be Empress Poppaea. The same hairstyle, the same clothes, the same jewelry, but everyone knows Poppaea is dead. Everyone knows this is a castrated boy. Yet they must bow, must address her as Augusta, must pretend the emperor's delusion is reality. This wasn't madness, it was method. By forcing Romans to participate in his fantasy, Nero was demonstrating ultimate power, the ability to define reality itself. July 18, 64 AD. A fire starts in the shops beneath the Circus Maximus. For 6 days it rages, destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts. While Nero probably didn't start the fire, he was in Antium when it began. What he did during and after reveals the complete dissolution of boundaries. Tacitus reports that Nero returned to Rome not to help, but to perform. He climbed a private stage and sang the fall of Troy while his city burned. When criticized, he opened his own gardens to refugees, but then used the chaos for darker purposes. Under cover of disaster and darkness, Nero would venture out in disguise with a gang of thugs. They would attack citizens fleeing the flames. Suetonius reports that Nero particularly targeted women, assaulting them while the city burned around them. One senator's wife fought back. When she later complained, her husband was forced to commit suicide. The fire gave Nero cover for escalation. In the refugee camps in his own gardens, he would select victims for his transformations. The traumatized, homeless citizens couldn't refuse the emperor who sheltered them. It was predation disguised as charity. But the fire gave Nero something else, space for his golden house. The Domus Aurea would cover 300 acres, a third of Rome. It included a 100-foot statue of Nero as the sun god, a rotating dining room that mimicked the Earth's rotation, and walls covered in gold and gems. In the entrance, Nero inscribed, "Finally, I can begin to live like a human being." Every tyrant needs an enabler, and Nero found his in Euphonius Tigellinus, appointed Praetorian prefect in 62 AD. Where previous advisors like Seneca tried to moderate Nero's impulses, Tigellinus amplified them. He was, in modern terms, a facilitator of abuse on an industrial scale. Tigellinus organized what Tacitus calls banquets on boats, floating orgies on artificial lakes. But these weren't mere parties. Picture this scene, an artificial lake constructed in the Campus Martius, boats filled with aristocratic women forced to play prostitutes. On the shores, makeshift brothels staffed with everyone from noble matrons to children. In the center, on a golden raft, Nero marries different partners throughout the night, while Rome's elite are forced to participate or watch. Tigellinus's innovation was systematization. He created lists of potential victims based on beauty, vulnerability, and political value. He organized talent scouts to find new subjects for Nero's interests. He managed the logistics of depravity like a military campaign. Dr. Robert Hansen's study on systematic abuse notes, Tigellinus represents a historical archetype, the administrator of atrocity. He provided structure to chaos, efficiency to evil. Without him, Nero's depravities might have remained sporadic. With him, they became institutional. To deflect blame for the fire, Nero needed scapegoats. He chose Christians, then a small, mysterious sect that Romans already viewed with suspicion. But Nero didn't just execute them. He transformed their deaths into sexualized spectacle. The historian Tacitus, himself no friend to Christians, was horrified enough to document what he witnessed. Christians weren't simply killed, they were transformed into mythological scenes for Nero's amusement. Women were tied to bulls in mockery of the myth of Pasiphae. Men were forced to reenact the rape of the Sabine women before execution. But most disturbing were the human tortures. Christians were covered in pitch, tied to posts, and set ablaze to illuminate Nero's garden parties. Guests would dine while humans burned alive as decoration. Nero would circulate among his guests in the costume of a charioteer, accepting congratulations on his artistic display. One account describes a young Christian woman who began singing hymns as she burned. Nero was so offended by her defiance that he ordered the remaining Christians' tongues cut out before burning. Even in murder, he demanded control of the narrative. The persecution revealed Nero's ultimate corruption, the fusion of sex, death, and spectacle into a single expression of power. It wasn't enough to kill. He had to transform death into art, suffering into entertainment, human beings into props. By 65 AD, even terror has diminishing returns. The Picenarian conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, brought together senators, knights, and even praetorian officers. They planned to assassinate Nero during the Games of Ceres and install Piso as emperor, but Nero's paranoia served him well. A freedman named Milicus betrayed the plot for reward. What followed was a purge that consumed Rome's intellectual elite. Seneca, Nero's former tutor, was forced to commit suicide. The poet Lucan bled to death reciting his own verses. The consul Vestinus was killed at his own dinner party, guests forced to continue eating as he died. But the conspiracy revealed something crucial. Nero had finally gone too far. The very senators who had applauded his performances and attended his orgies were now willing to risk everything to stop him. The social contract was broken beyond repair. March 68 AD. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, raises the standard of revolt. His proclamation doesn't focus on taxes or governance. It focuses on honor. He calls Nero the destroyer of the human race, and enemy of all gods and men. The revolt spreads like wildfire. Galba in Spain declares himself legate of the Senate and Roman people. Othniel Lusitania joins him. The armies of Germany waver. Even in Rome, graffiti appears overnight. When will this artist die? Nero's response reveals his complete break with reality. When told of Galba's revolt, his main concern was that Galba had criticized his lyre playing. He spent days designing new water organs instead of organizing defense. He planned to go to Gaul and weep before the rebels, believing his tears would move them to loyalty. June 8, 68 AD. Nero wakes in the palace to find his guards gone. His servants have fled. Even his poison taster has abandoned him. The Senate has declared him a public enemy, sentenced to die in the ancient fashion, beaten to death with rods. Picture this final pathetic scene. The master of the known world, reduced to fleeing Rome in disguise on a common horse. He takes shelter in his freedman Phaon's villa, crawling through a hole in the wall to enter. The man who built the Golden House now hides in a slave's room. As soldiers approach, Nero attempts suicide but lacks the courage. His secretary Epaphroditus must guide the blade to his throat. His last words? Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. Even at the end, he couldn't grasp reality. He thought he was a performer. Rome knew he was a monster. The Senate ordered damnatio memoriae, the erasure of Nero from history. His statues were destroyed, his name chiseled from monuments, his golden house buried. Rome tried to forget. Nero's death didn't bring peace. It brought chaos. The year of the four emperors, 69 AD, saw Rome tear itself apart. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fought for the throne. Nero had so degraded. The institutions that should have provided stability had been so corrupted that only military force could restore order. But Nero left a deeper scar. The Flavian dynasty that followed was obsessed with moral restoration. But the damage was done. Romans had seen their highest office turned into a brothel, their most sacred institutions mocked, their reality itself made negotiable. You can't unsee that. Perhaps most tellingly, Nero wouldn't stay dead in the Roman imagination. For 20 years after his suicide, false Neros appeared throughout the empire. At least 3 impostors gained significant followings, particularly in the eastern provinces where Nero had been popular for his artistic pretensions. This phenomenon reveals something disturbing. Despite everything, some Romans preferred even a false Nero to reality. The traumatized empire was susceptible to anyone who promised a return to the horrifying familiar rather than facing uncertain change. Dr. Sarah Chen's research on institutional corruption identifies Neronian patterns that recur throughout history. The performative cruelty designed to humiliate and bind witnesses, the sexualization of power and degradation of victims, the forced participation of institutions in their own corruption, the gradual normalization of the unconscionable. We see these patterns in Stalin's show trials, where victims were forced to confess to impossible crimes, in Mao's struggle sessions, where children denounced parents, in modern authoritarian states where reality itself becomes negotiable, where obvious lies must be accepted as truth. Dr. James Patterson's analysis is sobering. Every society thinks it's immune to a Nero. The Romans had 800 years of civilization, law, philosophy. They had institutions, checks and balances, traditions. None of it mattered when those responsible for maintaining boundaries decided their comfort mattered more than their duty. The warning isn't that we might get another Nero, it's that we wouldn't recognize him until it was too late. The slide from democracy to tyranny isn't a cliff, it's a slope, and each step seems reasonable at the time. A performance here, a boundary crossed there, applause for something that should horrify, silence when we should scream. Nero's reign teaches us that depravity isn't just personal, it's institutional. Every senator who applauded his performances enabled the next atrocity. Every guard who followed illegal orders normalized lawlessness. Every citizen who remained silent became complicit. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote, "The worst crimes were dared by few, willed by more, and tolerated by all." This is how civilizations fall, not in grand battles but in gradual compromises, in the slow acceptance of the unacceptable. If this historical deep dive disturbed you, good. History's darkest chapters should disturb us. They're warnings encoded in blood and suffering about what happens when good people choose comfort over conscience. Subscribe to the Hollow Throne for more explorations of history's shadows. Hit the notification bell. These stories matter now more than ever. Share this video. Not for shock value, but because forgetting these lessons guarantees repeating them. Remember, Nero wasn't born a monster. He was made by a system that rewarded excess and punished restraint, that chose stability over justice, that preferred a monster they knew to the uncertainty of change. The historian Suetonius ends his biography of Nero with a chilling observation. The world endured such a prince for nearly 14 years. Endured. Not suffered under, not survived. Endured. As if it was a choice. It was a choice. It's always a choice. The throne is always hollow. It's what we allow to fill it that matters. And remember, Nero had a 28% approval rating when he died. Think about that.